On this episode of Mythos Busters, we bring you our comprehensive new player guide. Everything you always wanted to know about getting into Arkham, but were afraid to ask. Except for on the forums where we ask the same questions a lot. But that's okay. Our goal was to make this episode a useful tool for the community, hopefully one of many places a new player could be pointed for some guidance on getting into the game. Now, when I say comprehensive, I really mean it. We went almost 3 hours on this bad boy, covering the various topics we wanted to discuss. Since not necessarily everyone will need all 3 hours of that info, we did our best to try to keep the most common and widely applicable topics to the beginning of the episode, and then we trudged on our normal path to obscurity as we went on through the episode. We've also included timestamps in the show notes for the different topics that we covered, so if your inquiry is really specific or you want to skip right to a specific part of the cast, you can definitely do that, so check the show notes. So, without further rambling, since I go ahead and do that at the beginning of the episode anyway, please enjoy the new player episode of Mythos Busters.
Mythos Busters, investigating the mystery, monsters, and madness of Arkham Horror, the card game.
Hello and welcome to episode 15 of Mythos Busters, where starting out just means you have so much horror yet to uncover. I'm Sean, and joining me tonight are the, as we've dubbed it, the Mythos Busters Classic team, as opposed to the Mythos Busters Legacy and Modern teams. We've got Ian.
Hello.
And Nick.
Hi, guys.
And tonight, we are doing something extra special. So despite, like I said, this being episode 15, we're going to go back to the beginning. So tonight's episode, we are going to do our best to lay out a new player guide. So the idea here is to run over some basic topics, some sort of, what did you wish you knew, or knowed, whatever the proper tense is for that verb. When you got into Arkham, knowing what we know now. The game's not quite a year yet, but we're well past the 6-month point. So our goal here tonight is to really come up with an evergreen resource, a useful resource for the community, so that hopefully if someone comes in and has questions about the game, about purchasing the game, playing the game, setting up the game, common newbie pitfalls, we're going to have a nice resource here that people can point them to if they're, if their preferred remedy is in audio form.
Isn't everyone's?
Really, well, you know what they say about the best medicine?
It's in your ears?
It's generally ibuprofen.
Oh, okay.
So this is, at the end of the day, this is an episode that will guide you on your way to experiencing the horror of Arkham. And you know what? Let's just go ahead and get it started. So, Nick, what is Arkham?
Funny you should ask that, Sean. No, Arkham is a cooperative living card game made by Fantasy Flight Games. It is set in FFG's Arkham Files license, the greater universe called the Arkham Files. And what this is it takes the Cthulhu mythos, which was started by H.P. Lovecraft, and then expanded on by many other authors throughout the years. It takes that basis, that mythos, and it kind of puts a little bit more of a gamified, more of a pulpy swing on top of it, so that it's a little bit more action-heavy than you would expect from like a Lovecraft title. But yeah, so that's Arkham Horror as far as what it is. It's a card game, you build a deck, you sit down maybe with some friends, maybe by yourself, and you play through cooperatively a story in an effort to reach a conclusion. Unlike other cooperative card games, this one is played over campaign primarily, so kind of a long-form game. You have multiple chapters that you can play through individually or as part of a big chain. And that's kind of the basics of what Arkham is. And really, if you're looking to get into Arkham, we should start with... I should probably go over these show notes here. Okay, so that's the basics of what Arkham is. What is your deck? What do you do? Well, you control a single character. When they first kind of announced Arkham, they teased it as a blend between card games and RPGs, in that your deck represents your character. So if you're familiar with tabletop role-playing games, you build a character and you control a character throughout the course of the story. And in Arkham, it's very much the same. You build a deck centered around one character. You choose cards that fit with that character's strategy or with different things that you want to do with that character. Your deck represents your character's strengths and weaknesses, which is very important. And then, yeah, like I said, it's just cooperative, start to finish in the story mode. Sitting down with friends if you have them, otherwise you're playing on your own or two-handed or whatever you want to call it from there. So, anything to add, guys? I think I kind of covered it in a meandering sort of way.
I guess one of the key attractions is the ability to kind of level up your character and do that very RPG thing of taking them from new blood on the block and gradually making them more powerful as they encounter stuff, or falling on your face and dying, whatever the case may be. But there's the opportunity to at least advance. And I guess the other thing that's worth mentioning is that the Arkham Files is kind of a broad universe / property that FFG has that includes Arkham Horror, the board game, which is like the granddaddy or daddy, however you're tracing the genealogy, and Eldritch Horror and Mansions of Madness and Elder
It's a very
Sign.
thin family tree.
Yeah.
It's the family poll.
But kind of what this game does is take some of the, stuff those board games do that tend to be very big, take up table space, take up time, and condense it down to a card game experience, which it does a very good job of.
Yeah.
And I think the other big thing to cover here is, as opposed to something that other things that might be close to it, I think one of the only other ones we really have that's close to it is the Lord of the Rings card game, which is really meant to be played scenario at a time in very discrete experiences, like Nick said. The experience in Arkham, the default experience in Arkham, is meant to be played as an overarching campaign. So the idea is you start with a very simplistic, level 0, generally, investigator deck. And throughout the course of the campaign, through your pitfalls and triumphs, you'll level up this deck with other strengths and weaknesses and really kind of make it your own. And the whole idea is not necessarily in each scenario to win or lose, but really to reach a kind of narrative culmination, as it were.
But some scenarios definitely have a good culmination and a bad one.
There are definitely good and bad fifis to have at the end of each scenario, but for the most part, there's not a straight you win, you lose, this is the end right here. It still continues regardless of what happens.
Yeah, a lot of times you'll be left hanging not knowing what some of the stuff that happened to you, what actual effect that's going to happen. At least assuming you're kind of playing the scenarios as they're being released and not peeking ahead. But I think that's definitely something that sets it apart from almost every other game that I can think of, is it has that sense of like, this is part of a larger story, and while there are kind of the victories and defeats, as you guys mentioned, it does have that sense of like, it's not a definitive answer, and kind of you have to interpret a lot of like, how well did I do?
Right.
So over the course of our discussion tonight, we're going to talk briefly about what you need to buy to play the game. We're going to talk about how you actually set up the game, deck construction, and what some of the different formats you might take on to actually play the game. We're going to talk about common player mistakes, common newbie mistakes, very common questions that generally hit the boards from people who are picking the game up fresh. We're going to talk about different ways you might bling out your game. So I think about 3 out of the 5 of us are very heavy into game pimping. So we've got some thoughts there. And then we're going to close it up with some other community tools you might look at if you want to dive deeper into this community. And last, we'll close with some other games you might enjoy if you're liking Arkham. So, Nick, what do we need to buy?
That's a very good question, Sean. What do you need to play Arkham? Well, really, if you're playing on your own or with one other person, you can get the core set, just the Arkham Horror the Card Game core box, and that is literally the only product you need to sit down and play the game. It has everything you need in it to build up to 2 decks and run through the 3 scenarios that come in that core box, which is kind of a short campaign. So really, that's the only thing that you absolutely need. However, one of the biggest discussions out there continuing from when the game released to now, is how many core sets do I need? Well, obviously, like I just said, you really only need one, but there are various opinions out there as far as what is the quote-unquote ideal amount, ideal number of core sets to obtain. So let's talk about that a little bit. Now, like we said, Arkham Horror can play up to 4 players, but with just one core box, you can only build decks for 2 players. And even then, your choices of what decks you can build are kind of limited, just based off the card pool that comes in a single box. So if you want...
Elaborate on that, Nick.
Oh, sure. So in the core box, it comes with 5 investigators, and again, each player controls 1 investigator. And each investigator uses 2 different factions, which the game calls classes, 2 different classes of cards. The core box comes with enough cards in each class to form exactly half of a deck. You need 30 cards, and there's, I think, 15, or no, less than that. There's like 10 cards per class in the core set. And then you splash in some neutrals and you have a deck. So if I were to pick, for instance, Roland, who uses the Guardian and the Seeker classes, I would have to use literally all of the Guardian cards and all of the Seeker cards in the core box. And then whoever is playing with me would have to pick a character that doesn't use either Guardian or Seeker. So that, again, that limits your choices for who you can pair up with, but that is ultimately the minimum that you can do. So...
I think the other maybe detail to point out there is that overall in the card game, you're allowed to put up to 2 copies of a single card in your deck by name. And the core set, for the most part, aside from a few neutral cards, which we'll get to, it only comes with 1 copy of each card. So you're really, when you're buying a core set, you're buying half of a full play set for a single person. So now, that being said, the game is still totally playable with 1 core. All of us here played the game for several months before we were able to get our hands on a second core set. So don't feel like you need to buy 2 to try the game out. 1 core set will get you there to at least figure out what the experience looks like and whether or not you want to buy into it farther.
Yeah, I guess that's the key thing. Like, don't feel like you have to just immediately double up if you are unsure whether you're going to like it. But once you figure out that you're going to like this game, then I'd say at that point, like, that second core is needed in the sense that it does give you that full play set of cards and allows you to actually deck build. Otherwise, deck building in the core set is pretty much just smashing cards from 2 classes together, which we'll get to the classes a bit later, but there's not really deck building with 1 core. So if you're trying out the game, or if you plan on just playing this as like a super casual board game and you don't really care about deck building that much, and you're just going to kind of supplement your core set cards by buying the expansions, then those are the cases where I would say just 1 core. Otherwise, 2 cores, which you go for. And people who aren't familiar with LCGs often get thrown by this. Like, why the heck am I buying multiple copies of the same game? Like, it does seem insane if you've never played an LCG before, but it's completely standard for every other LCG that Fantasy Flight does, and Arkham Horror is actually better than most in the respect that you only need 2, where a lot of other LCGs you have to buy actually 3 copies of the core set to get the full play set. So, all in all, though it sounds strange at first, it's not an investment I really look back on and say, oh, why did I spend that money? Like, it's totally worth it in this game. There's not a lot of wasted stuff also compared to other LCGs. So, yeah, just some things to keep in mind.
Sure. And
so if you've done the math, buying yourself 2 core sets will get you a full play set for a single player. Now, at what point, guys, do you think a person needs to start thinking about the possibility of a third? Because I think this is what trips a lot of people up. Like, going from a single core set to 2 core sets is pretty self-explanatory. It's like, hey, you want the full card pool for any given deck? 2 core sets, there you go. But there are some arguments out there for going, over 2 core sets, even if you're only a single person. So I think one of the main ones is how many people are you going to be supplying for in this playgroup? So, for instance, if you're a person who plays with 3 other people and you're the only one who's actively collecting the game yourself, there might be an argument there for a 3rd or maybe even a 4th core set, depending on how crazy you want to get.
Yeah, and definitely if you're also someone who likes to build a deck and then not dismantle it in order to try other decks or other characters, having more than 2. Like, you could do that. You could probably build 1 deck with 2 core sets and leave that deck around. But then if you then sit down to play a 3-player game and someone wants to play some cards that are in your single-player deck, you got to kind of finagle it a little bit. Whereas with additional cores, you wouldn't have to do that. You could have one deck that's for this is my 1-player deck, this is my 3-player deck, this is that sort of thing. So, yeah, it all depends on really how many decks you want to be able to construct and leave constructed as well.
Leave constructed, and I think another big thing is if you're maybe looking at a situation where you might have 2 players who might want the same cards. There are certain cards in certain classes that are just kind of staples, that anyone who has access to them will want them. So you also have to weigh whether or not, or how accepting you are of the idea that you might have to cannibalize another deck or make compromises between those 2 decks even though they want the same cards. If you are no compromises, every deck that I build needs to be the most powerful or the most efficient that it can be, definitely there's a good argument for 3 or 4 cores depending on your player count. But if you're okay making compromises, 2 will get you by.
Mm-hmm. I will say that as someone who has played pretty often with more than 2 players, I will say that having 2 core sets is a little difficult to build 4 decks right out the gate. Like, you can do it, but if you want to be able to fully customize and explore all the options, you're going to be tight with by the time you get around to that 4th deck, you're going to be like, well, I guess I'll just put these in because no one else is using them, and I can't use that card because someone else. So you're going to have to make compromises once you get about to that 4th deck on 2 cores. So.
Yeah, and then I think the last thing to maybe bring up as we're talking about how many cores is right now we sit, and as far as the life of the game goes, we sit with having the core released, the first deluxe expansion, which we'll get to what that is in a second, and the first 3 Mythos packs. So the card pool in general right now is pretty small. But if you're coming to this game 2-3 years down the road and we've had 3 cycles or so, that extra core set is probably going to mean less to you because there will be more variety of player cards that might do similar things to the cards in the core set than there are now. Right now, our options are few. But when your options are many, if you're coming to this and there's a wall of Arkham product, maybe I'd buy 2 cores, see how you sit with it, and if you really want those staples from the core set, spring on the 3rd. But I think people agonize over this decision a lot, and what I would just recommend for anyone is just buy them one at a time. Mm-hmm. And you'll know after you buy the second one whether or not you're going to need the 3rd one pretty quickly.
Yep.
Well, and a lot of big part of it too that comes back to it, and we haven't really talked about it, but it's just, how much are you willing to spend for the quote-unquote base of the game? 1 core set usually runs around $40, so obviously if you want to get multiples of that, you're going to look at $80, $120 for 2 or 3 core sets. If that's more than you're comfortable dropping for just the base, the basic level of this game, then obviously there's no need. You can make 4 players work with 2 core sets. You can make 2 players work with 1 core set. So consider that as well.
All right, Nick. So now that we've covered at length that question of how many cores, and hopefully saved everyone who's listening to this the forum post that the rest of us get so, I don't want to say sick of, because this community is pretty good about being accepting of new players and newbie questions, but at the same time, you can only see that question repeated so many times before you start to roll your eyes. So hopefully we've saved some people from posting on it.
You start developing a reflex of twitch after a while.
You do, and we have the best intentions, and I think as far as communities I've been involved in go, the LCG community is pretty top-notch. But still, patience is finite in every form. So, Nick, what else might someone need to look out to buy if they're looking to get into this game?
So, like we mentioned, this game runs, it's generally played in the campaign format, which means that you'll sit down and play one game, or quote-unquote one scenario, and that scenario will only be a single facet or a fraction or just a piece of an overall story. And the core set has a 3-scenario campaign, but that's a short campaign. That campaign is meant to introduce you to the game and kind of what this game is about. However, the next release after the core set, and probably the first thing you'll be looking at for expansion, is called a deluxe expansion. It's a box of over 100 cards, I believe, and it has a bunch of new player cards. So stuff that you can add into your investigator deck, as well as, in this particular case, the one deluxe expansion we have out so far, comes with the first 2 scenarios of an 8 scenario campaign, so a much longer campaign. Now that deluxe expansion, again, that's going to increase your card pool by quite a bit, and it's going to get you started on that campaign. Now the downside to running this game as a campaign is that once you get those first 2, you kind of need to keep going, unless you're totally fine playing standalone and just going, I don't need to know the repercussions of this, I don't need to know what happens after these scenarios. These scenarios are fun in and of themselves. But if you do have any desire to see the story through, well, then you're going to have to buy what are called Mythos packs, and these are much smaller. They have a much shorter release span. So the deluxe expansion came out, and then I think it was 2 or 3 months, or maybe it was just 1 month before our first Mythos pack. But the group of 6 Mythos packs is what we call a cycle. And so right now we are in the Dunwich cycle. And once we get our 6th and last Mythos pack for that, that'll be a full campaign. Each Mythos pack has some player cards, and it has a scenario. So if you're interested in that story and playing a campaign through to its completion, you're going to need to get the deluxe expansion plus the 6 following Mythos packs.
Now, it bears pointing out that FFG's ambition for releasing these packs is generally monthly. Now, they've actually done a really good job with Arkham thus far, but our experience in prior LCGs, we just know, so fair warning to everyone, that doesn't always hold up. Sometimes there are shipping delays, sometimes there are distribution issues, and at the end of the day, it's not always monthly, but that's kind of what they go for.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And as far as cost goes, the deluxe expansion, I believe, was around $30, and each Mythos pack is around $12 or $15. And they add more options for both players, as well as adding the continuing sections of the story. So it expands your game quite a bit once you consider all of those.
Yeah, I think another aspect is that you can play these scenarios standalone. There are rules for standalone mode. That's perfectly viable if you just want a quick game or whatnot, but we did mention kind of the story is very tends to end in a lot of cliffhangers, and you're not sure exactly what happened. So I think a lot of people I have no idea the exact numbers, but people mostly tend to play campaign. So in the future, I think what happens with LCGs a lot is cycles or parts of cycles as a game goes on will go in and out of print. They always get reprinted eventually as long as the game is alive. And sometimes, though, it's a matter of waiting. Like I know Lord of the Rings, which is the other cooperative LCG, is 5-6 years into its life, and so a lot of times new players will get into the game and be like, oh, I can't get these packs from the first cycle because they're always going out of print. They have to wait 4 or 5 months, whatever the case, to get them. So in the future that may happen with Arkham, I'm not sure, but in that case I think what newer players would have to do is the incentive would be to play the cycles that are newest, that are in print. So that you don't have to wait around a long time to finish a campaign or pay exorbitant prices on eBay or whatever. But I think the nature of the game, because it's not just flat where there are no levels, I think this game is really designed to be friendly to new players in that way, that I imagine players will be able to jump into later cycles without feeling like they're getting slammed because they don't have these player cards from previous cycles.
It also bears saying, and I don't think we explicitly said this, but each cycle, with its deluxe and its accompanying Mythos packs, is self-contained. Or at least it's been self-contained in Lord of the Rings, and we have every reason to believe, outside of an official, explicit announcement, that each of them are self-contained from FFG. So, if you do come to this game a little bit later, maybe Dunwich is sold out at the time. We recently had the new deluxe expansion, Carcosa, or Signs of Carcosa?
Path to Carcosa.
Thank you, Path to Carcosa. So if that one's in print, you could start that and easily experience the game, throughout that cycle, waiting for Dunwich to come out. So if that's the case, one resource I would point you to is the Fantasy Flight Games website, wherein they have an upcoming tab. And this is a great way to filter out kind of the LCGs or any other products they have coming out, and they'll tell you generally where they are in the production process.
Mm-hmm.
So if something's sold out, you'll generally see it's either awaiting reprint at the printers, on the boat, coming over to be distributed, shipping out, in stock, whatever it happens to be. If you're curious about where things are at, you can check that. Don't do what I did, where you start Lord of the Rings, or Arkham in this case, and one of the second or third adventure or Mythos pack is one that you really want to get a hold of, and you think that they're just out. They're done. They're done printing them. That's not what happens, guys. You don't need to go to a French site to find a UK printing of this thing and pay $60 when it normally only costs $15. Learn from my mistakes.
Yep, that's why we do the podcast. So you can learn from us, yeah. And additionally, in addition to deluxe expansions and Mythos packs, FFG does release as well standalone scenarios, which are packs of cards that are meant to be played on their own. Now, at least according to the ones that we have had thus far, they are strictly scenario cards. So there aren't cards that can be added into a player deck right away unless you then complete the scenario contained therein. Standalone scenarios, we currently have 2. They generally run about as much as a Mythos pack, so around that $15 mark, if memory serves. And these are, again, they're not connected to a campaign in any way, so if you're worried about being able to complete a cycle, or if you're worried about the availability of past cycles, you can definitely get your core sets and then look at standalone scenarios until you're ready to jump headfirst into a full deluxe expansion and cycle.
Or if you just want a one-shot fun challenge. I think if there's any argument to be made for the standalone version of this game, it's not in campaign. It's for these print-on-demand standalone packs. Mm-hmm. And the other thing to point out is they are actually produced differently from the standard card set. So your core set, your deluxe packs, your Mythos packs are all printed in China through FFG's producer and shipped over here and then distributed. The standalone packs, the print-on-demand packs is actually what they're called because that's exactly what they are. FFG prints those in-house and then ships them out via distribution. So there is a difference in the card quality and the printing. The print-on-demand packs are a little bit muddier, I guess is the only thing I can say, but at the same time, it's kind of cool because FFG is able to produce them a little bit more quickly. And I'm trying to think what else I was going to say. Oh yes, a lot of times these packs are tied to a specific event. Mm-hmm. So for instance, the first one that we have, The Curse of the Rougarou, was a special event pack that we got at Arkham Nights 2016, which is FFG's Arkham Files event that they run every year. So we had it at the event. It was very exclusive for a month or two, and then those print-on-demand packs went kind of public, and anyone whose store was able to get distribution was able to get them, and you can actually order them directly from FFG.
Yeah, but that pretty much covers it as far as what the different products are, at least the FFG official products related to this game. But yeah, the core set is your base, the deluxe expansion starts off your campaigns, and the standalones are exactly that, standalone. So that's basically it for what to buy and what to look out for.
So let's cover the core issue again very quickly. I'm sorry, guys. This gets posted on all the time. So here's my advice. Buy them one at a time. Plan for one. Probably plan for two. If you plan to get into this game, just straight up plan for two. Maybe even spring for two if you're super serious about getting into the game. And then from there, you'll be able to tell whether you need another one or not because you know what you're getting. Don't agonize at the beginning of, oh, do I need 2 or 3? Well, I'm buying for 3 people, one of which is going to collect themselves, but we might want to combine sets. But sometimes they'll bring their dog, who might also want to play, but he doesn't want to use survivor cards, so we don't need to worry about that. But then, like, on and on, don't worry about it. Just get a core. At that point, you'll know whether you need another one.
Right, yeah. And don't game with dogs.
Well,
I think there's a certain investigator who might argue with that.
All right. So that being said, now people know what they need to buy. What are some tips and tricks? I guess some play format and deck construction concepts that they might want to be familiar with as they crack open that box again.
Okay, so you got your core set, or core sets as the case may be, and you break it open. You might be brand new to deck construction because you just saw Arkham Horror, you like the theme, or the campaign sounds fun, whatever the case may be, but you've never played a game like this where you're constantly building and tweaking decks. So you might be wondering at that point, how do I even go about this? So we'll cover that briefly, and also kind of like what are the different ways you can play the game. So the initial basis is you're going to build a deck. Well, first you choose an investigator, and that's going to tell you kind of all the restrictions, what cards you can include, how many cards to include in your deck. It's all spelled out on the back of whatever investigator you pick. And from there you start building. Each of the investigators is associated with a class. There are 5 classes. And each of them has a different flavor. Before we started recording, we were kind of jokingly sorting all these classes into Captain Planet elements. We're not going to go over that again, but it just kind of shows how they each have their different flavor. I'm sure you could sort them into a lot of different ways, like Hogwarts houses and whatever the case may be. So the kind of the different flavors, these are classes, and if you've played a board game or RPG in the past 20, 30 years, I'm sure you're probably familiar with the idea of classes in some form. But the classes in Arkham, the first is Guardian. That's kind of like the fighter. They're the blue class. They're the ones who are going to be doing a good share of the combat. They are all about kind of protecting others and being all noble like that. The
Snore.
Yeah. Oh, shut up.
Seeker is the yellow class. They are all about investigating and finding clues, which are a huge part of the game. So they are, in a lot of ways, key to driving games forward if they are on the board, because they are the brainiacs. They're the ones who are good at unraveling the mysteries. The rogue class or the green class, some would say the best class.
Some are wrong.
Rogues are all about kind of bending the rules, gambling. There's a heavy gambling theme in there. If you're familiar with rogues and RPGs, they like to do shady stuff like backstab, sneak around, blindside enemies. Rogues are all about that kind of thing and finding ways to win and advance in different ways, and less straightforward ways, I guess I would say. Just being sneaky all around, I guess, is a good way to put it. Mystic is the purple class. They like to play with fire. This is the spell class. If you're attracted to wizards and warlocks and all that kind of thing, this is the class for you. They're the ones with spells. They're the ones who like to take big risks, kind of making these dark pacts, getting these big powerful effects, but with a chance that it could blow up in their face or possess them or whatever the case may be. So that's Mystic.
We're the ones who bring the awesome to the table.
Sure, that's a way to put it. And the final class is kind of the oddball. This is the heart of Captain Planet, or the Hufflepuff of Hogwarts. This is Survivor, the red class. And just like I said, they don't quite fit into a nice slot like the other classes. They are all about the underdog. Having the chance to kind of listen and talk to the designers in the past, they've really said this has been inspired by horror movies where you have these people who have no business surviving, just regular everyday people, and they find a way to survive. In game terms, these are the ones who kind of get beneficial effects from like failing, when usually failing would be a bad thing. Just finding ways to like come back when they should be down. That's what Survivor's all about. In terms of classes, is there anything I forgot? Anything you guys want to add?
Yeah, so I think it's important to point out that each investigator, even though they identify with a main class, each investigator that we've seen so far has the ability to dive into the cards, at least a little bit, sometimes a lot bit, of the other classes. So for instance, in the core set, you'll see that every class, or every investigator rather, has a main class and then also has a subclass. So you can take any card of the main class, and then you can take up to basically the mid-level cards of their off class, which in the core set actually doesn't preclude them from a whole lot of cards. but as we go on in the game, it might. So I don't know, and I think what's interesting about this game is that every investigator is really unique. We've even, at this point, in Path to Carcosa, had spoiled that we have a neutral investigator coming out that we don't actually have a class for. She can kind of take the shades of any other class that she chooses to. So, really, the classes are just a guideline, and I don't know. I think everyone kind of gravitates toward their favorite, but it's not as distinct as like you pick a class and you play this class. You have room to bend into other places depending on which investigator you're using.
Well, and not only that, but even within a class, at least the ones we have so far, and I think we could safely say future investigators as well, each investigator plays drastically different, despite the fact that they're still pulling from the main source of, or the main card pool as, like, let's take our two Seekers, Daisy and Rex. They're both using Seeker cards primarily in their deck. However, they play, and their strategy, it's very different from one to the next, what you're going to be doing with them. So the classes they really just define the majority, or at least a large portion of cards that you will be able to include. But the investigators themselves are where the differing play styles really come out.
And I guess relevant to new players who might be new to this whole deck building thing is that you should, give the different investigators a try, see what works. I think one thing the community has talked about is how certain investigators might not jive with your particular playstyle. Like people will say, oh, I like Agnes or I like Roland or whatever, but I never get them to work. And yet other people play them and they get them to work just fine. So I think what that says is take the time to get to know these different investigators, different classes, and figure out what works for you. Obviously, you can play them all whenever you want, but you'll probably find some that really connect with you. And the other cool thing is I will say there's probably certain classes that are more friendly to new players and some that are a little bit more difficult to get into, and probably more so than classes, the actual investigators. So for a new player, I think Roland is always a good place to start because he's relatively straightforward. He gives you a good balance of investigating and fighting, and someone like Wendy is kind of more on the other end of the scale where it takes you a bit of time to figure out how exactly to get her to work because she has some clear weaknesses but also some clear strengths. So that's kind of a basic overview of the classes. We'll go into some more of kind of general deck building tips, but first you can talk about like different ways to play the game. And so the first one is that this is a game that you can play solo, all by yourself. That in fact, that's one of the main attractions. It's a way that a lot of people play this game. It's true.
It's probably why you're here.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's be honest.
Yep. I mean, and solo gaming has become a huge thing in the past couple of years. Lord of the Rings LCGs was one of the early wave, and then now we're getting a lot. But yeah, a lot of people are coming to that for that reason. So true solo, it's just you pick one investigator, you play that investigator, gets the scenarios. Works great. Perfectly fine way to play. I play a lot of my games that way. The one thing you have to keep in mind with true solo is that you kind of have to cover everything. There's no white knight, there's no superhero that's going to charge in to save you. It's just you, it's just your deck. So all the things you have to worry about in a game, like finding clues and finding enemies, you have to figure out a way for your deck to make that happen. The contrast to that is, in terms of playing solo, is that some people play what's called two-handed solo, which is we do. You pretend like you are two players. You pick two investigators, you build decks for those investigators, and you play a game using those two investigators against the different scenarios. So you're basically playing a two-player game, but just by yourself is kind of the alternative mode of solo. And there's pros and cons to both of those. The biggest pro, I said true solo, is you kind of have to cover everything else. And two-handed, you can specialize your decks more, and you have a little bit more breathing room because the two decks can cover for each other.
Also, you can test out more things that you want to try at once. That's a big one. If you're like, oh hey, I really want to try out Rex, and oh man, I want to try out Zoe, but you've got 3 hours this week to play Arkham. Two-handed's a great way to go.
Yeah, and there's also, when you're playing true solo, again, it's a mode of the game I like, but there are kind of just entire parts of the game that you're not gonna experience, which is the engage action, generally being able to kind of take pressure off for other players without going into too much detail about that. Like all the multiplayer stuff, there are certain keywords that don't really have any effect in solo. Right. So again, I find it to be completely satisfying. I love true solo, but for a new player, just be aware there's certain parts of the game that you don't experience in that mode.
Well, and we've even seen, at this point at least, there are just straight up cards that you have no business putting in a solo deck. But
yeah.
Once you have one other investigator, then it's like, okay, this kind of has a use now. And it bums me out that most of those cards are in my home class of Guardian. Whatever.
Hey, you're the support class, it turns out.
Shut your mouth. I am not support.
I mean, your card pool would beg to differ, but that wasn't a diss.
Oh, no, you guys support me.
One thing I will say on one-handed versus two-handed is definitely start one-handed, because that lets you get down the mechanics of the game. One-handed requires less mental bandwidth, and it lets you really kind of get down the rhythm of the game. Once you've done that, try out two-handed if you don't readily have people around who are ready to play with you regular multiplayer. Try it out, because it is fun, because in true solo you're kind of forced to do everything. So the way you have to build and play your investigator is that I'm doing everything. I'm fighting, I'm dodging, I'm getting clues. But as soon as you break into two-handed solo, you can really start to specialize, and specialized decks get to be really fun. You can pull out some really interesting combos and do things that you wouldn't normally be able to do in true solo because someone else is shoring up your weakness.
Yeah, and also keep in mind, one thing to know is that certain investigators have a harder time in true solo versus in two-handed or even multiplayer. So off the top of my head, in the core, Roland and Agnes will do you pretty well in true solo. Mm-hmm. But if you take on Daisy, say, and try to run her true solo as a brand new player, you're gonna have a bad time. Like, unless you're just like a supreme master and you take to the game really fast, and even then you need some luck on your side. So just keep that in mind, that if you try an investigator and you get trounced in true solo, it may be that you need some help and need to improve, but it may also just be that you picked an investigator who's not well suited for that. And just in general, I've played a lot of true solo and two-handed. It depends on investigator, but in general, I would say true solo is slightly more difficult than two-handed, just because you are all by yourself, and even though you're revealing fewer encounter cards, that there's the chance you could get put in a situation you can't get out of, and there's no one to help you. So, just another thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, in true solo, one bad test could literally end the game, whereas if you have at least one other player, one bad test would likely slow you down, but it's very unlikely that it would stop progress entirely.
Yeah.
So.
In true solo, no one can hear you scream.
It's very true. So yeah, starting in true solo is good, but if you are just struggling, you might want to try two-handed solo and just get your confidence up, get some wind in your sails, be able to try out different investigators at the same time, and then be able to go back to true solo after that.
Now, what if you have friends?
What?
I know, right? It's a foreign concept, but there are people out there.
If you do have other human beings around you, or supernatural creatures that can play with you, then multiplayer is an option. Up to 4 players. You can play multiplayer. Each person picks a different investigator. You get going in that way. The fun part of multiplayer, other than having other humans to interact with, is then you really get to specialize and kind of get all kinds of crazy interactions. Because when you have 3 or 4 people playing, not only do you have 3 or 4 people worth of ideas, but you can set up all kinds of cool combos and, you know, double, triple team enemies, figure out how to trick them, just do all kinds of cool stuff. If you can find friends out there, it's definitely a fun way to play. And you can, you know, each person can take on these very defined roles. Like, I'm just going to find clues and nothing else, or I don't care about clues. I'm just going to hack down enemies. That's all I want to do. You can really go crazy with that in multiplayer.
One piece of advice, and especially since we're kind of, I'm guessing, we're kind of segueing into deck construction here pretty quick, but even in multiplayer, I would say that the smart deck builder would still, quote-unquote, generalize to some degree. Because as someone who's played quite a few 3- and 4-player games, there are times that if you build your deck too specialized, and me being a Guardian player, sometimes I do, where I'm just like, this deck is my gun deck, and I only put guns in this deck. Well, then if there's no enemies in play, then I'm like just sitting on my thumbs, just waiting for something to do, and you kind of want to be able to still tackle every facet to the game, at least to some degree. Throw yourself a couple cards in there that let you get clues so that you're not just a waste of actions.
Oh, see, here I thought you were gonna come at me for our last game where I was playing Daisy, like Super Clover Daisy, and be like, Nick, get this rats off me.
They're so small and furry.
I don't like it.
You did hit one game where you weren't really pulling your weight, but, you know, I didn't want to make you feel bad for it. So, but no, I had that too, where it's like, well, there's no enemies around, so I guess I'll investigate at 2 versus 3. Hey, I failed. Who could have seen that coming? You know, like, every deck has that to some degree. So that's why even in multiplayer, you still want to be able to do a couple things outside of your core strategy.
Yeah, the other side of the coin with
Go
multiplayer is that I mentioned that players can set up cool combos, but now that you're revealing 3 or 4 encounter cards per turn in multiplayer, the encounter deck can set up cool combos too, or not so cool combos. So,
cool's a word.
So while true or solo or two-handed solo is kind of a more controlled experience in some ways, multiplayer is really more of like the beautiful chaos type thing. And so if that makes you anxious, you might not like it as much, but it also leads to some fun because it is just like anything can happen.
It really, really is beautiful chaos. I love, especially pickup multiplayer where there's no coordination.
Oh man,
everyone's just kind of doing it. Oh, there's magic to be found in those games. So, talking a little bit about deck building in general, one of our hosts, Scott, could not be here tonight, and he had some good tips as our resident power gamer. So, when you crack open the core, if you've got your one core, the core set is nice enough to have these pre-constructed decks for each investigator. So you have a really good starting point that FFG and the developers kind of recommend you start with so you can get a feel for the game. But once you start branching out into building your own deck, it can get away from you pretty quickly if you don't kind of have an idea of what you're doing. So I think one of the first things to talk about is deck composition. So there are 3 types of player cards in the game. We've got your assets, which are going to be your more permanent cards that sit on the board, you know, your allies, your weapons, your general ability effects, that sort of thing. Your events that are going to be a quick, I play this, cool stuff happens, and then it goes into my discard pile. And then skills, which is actually something that's very unique to this game. So, you know, throughout the game, you're going to be required to do these different skill tests, say, testing your combat, testing your willpower. And most cards in the game have skill icons on the card, where if you're not going to play the card, you can discard icons that match the test that you're currently doing, and that will add to your total. So when you look at deck construction, Scott laid out, I think, is a pretty good baseline for what it should look like. So start with about 12 assets, 10 events, and 8 skills. And from there, you can kind of figure out what else you want to put in that deck, or where you want to put more weight, less weight, what have you. It's a really big generalization, but you can also get into that situation where, hey, I've got 16 skills in this deck, and I'm not drawing anything that's going to help me establish a board presence. That's a problem.
Yeah, I know some of our kind of experienced advanced players at this point will be like, what are you talking about? Like, what about my 2-asset super deck that destroys everything in sight? But this is like the starting skeleton. I remember starting Lord of the Rings. I'd, very rusty on this kind of deck building, and I used something similar for that game, just like rough percentages, and that helped me get comfortable. It's kind of one of those things like when you're learning writing or other skills that you kind of have to learn the rules so you know how to break them properly. So if you're really just brand new player, you have no idea what you're doing, then you can just follow this a kind of rough generalization like that. And then once you see what the deck looks like, maybe for your investigator, you say, well, I was supposed to put 12 in here, but 2 of these I don't think they're that good, so let me dump those and I'll add 2 events, or whatever the case may be. But it's good to have kind of those goals to shoot for, just to, give you a rough skeleton to work from.
And I think Scott wanted to mention a shout out to one of our listeners, Orange Required, in our Discord for that tip. And Mr. Trench in our chat here, who's friend of the show as well, mentioned that another thing to look out for when you're constructing the deck, aside from the kind of asset event skills delineation, is what's called a cost curve. So the idea there is that if you were to take the cards in your deck and lay out, okay, how many cards in my deck cost 0? How many cost 1, 3, 4, 5? I skipped 2, but you know it's there. 2 is always reliable. It's going to be there for you. If you lay out the costs of the cards in your deck, what does the curve of that deck look like? For the most part, most of the cards in your deck should be cost 2 or under. Because you start with 5 resources in this game, and you only drip in 1 per turn. So outside of actively, having cards in your deck that give you resources outside of that normal framework, it's kind of a slow drip. So the idea is to keep your deck kind of lean and mean, so that of a hand of 5 cards rather, you'd be pretty well positioned to play most of them. If you stack your deck up with 3, 4, 5 cost cards, you're going to get to play one of those like every 3 turns, and you are going to be slow and not very effective. So in addition to looking at assets, events, skills, also look at your cost curve and just make sure you're not loaded up with high cost cards, because again, you're going to have a bad time. So
yeah, and one.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to say, and one thing that specifically related to cost curve that I look at. We mentioned that as you complete scenarios in this game and progress through a campaign, you'll be upgrading your deck and actually changing the cards that are in it, spending the points that you earn from one game to get better cards or other options to include. One thing that I look at, specifically with cost curve, is that when I upgrade a card, let's talk about Shotgun, for instance. Shotgun
I knew you were going to bring it around to Shotgun. I freaking knew it.
It's very smart to include a Shotgun. I mean, but it's an expensive card. It costs 5 resources. It's one of the most expensive ones that Guardians have. So when I take cards out of my deck to then make room for the Shotguns that I so wisely purchased, I look at cards that cost 4 or 5 or 6 resources if I had them, which I usually don't in a Guardian deck. But anyway, I don't want to take out like a free card, like a 0 cost card, and put in a 5 cost. Because that's going to skew, even if it's just 1 or 2 cards, it's going to skew the deck away from those early game plays and make me more reliant on having those late game, those higher cost, the higher amount of resources to play the more expensive cards in my deck. That might be a bit more advanced than what we were talking about, but it just hit me, so I figured I'd talk.
Well, I mean, anything here is useful. I think another thing that Scott points out here that I fully agree with, and that can be a little tough in the core set, but hear us out. Every deck should have a way to deal with small enemies. Now, you can get away in this game with being kind of a slippery, sneaky, for the most part, investigator. But if you get stuck with rats or acolytes, which are among some of the smaller enemies in the game, if it takes you 3 to 4 actions to deal with that before you can get back to what you were doing, then the encounter deck won that little engagement. So every deck should have a way to deal with a small enemy, to deal out a direct damage, to do a quick evade and move, to deal with those enemies in some way. So in the core set, I'm going to think. So Agnes just has a built-in way with her ability. She's head and shoulders above everyone else as far as dealing with small enemies, unfortunately. Roland is well positioned just in general with his stats. Skids, I would probably put in about that category as well. He's not quite as well positioned as Roland, but dealing with small enemies ain't no thing. Daisy, in the core set only, she's pretty rough. She's only got, Mind Over Matter is about the only thing she's got to deal with small enemies. Any enemies, for that matter. I suppose if you're splashing in Shriveling. And then Wendy...
And don't forget about Knife.
Oh, yes, Knife. Of course, Knife. Well, you know what? To be fair, as far as dealing with rats go, you could do worse than Knife.
Right.
And then Wendy's probably one of the better examples of kind of a sneaky way to do it, where she's got really high evade, and she's got things like Sneak Attack, where you can evade something, then damage it. Though that might be a waste on a rat. But the whole idea there is, the big enemies are kind of meant to be action soakers, so that when you're engaged with the big enemy, it's going to take you a fair few actions, whether they're yours or someone else's, to deal with that enemy. But if you're wasting lots of actions on a small enemy, the encounter deck is winning. So think about that as you're constructing a deck too. Is just making sure you have an answer for when a situation like that comes up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, in general, those are the two big questions. Like, do I have an answer for enemies in general? Do I have an answer for getting clues? And if you're playing solo, then you have to make sure you have strong answers to both of those, and several answers, so you have some backup plans in case you don't draw your first choice. And in multiplayer, you can maybe prioritize one more than the other.
So I think another thing that Scott pointed out here that I wanted to touch on. The combo thing, I think, maybe is getting a little advanced, but weaknesses. So your basic weakness that every investigator, at least in the core set, has to take is locked in to your deck. You're allowed to look at it, and if you're really gaming the game, you should. Because that'll kind of give you an idea of... One fun thing about this game, and I say fun in the loosest term, one fun thing about this game is every time you draw a card from your deck, you stand a chance of drawing one of your weaknesses, a card that will actually hurt you, as opposed to just about every other card game in the world where every time you draw a card from your deck, it's only going to do good things.
Unless it's a land.
Right, unless it's a land. But that being said, the weaknesses are locked in. They're part of your deck. If you're really gaming it, you should look at it so you know what could possibly happen to you when you take an action to draw a card. But that said, I think many of us have played by the house rule that if you don't want to look at your basic weakness and kind of get surprised by it the first game, you can do that too. And it's kind of fun in its own way, in its own masochistic way. But just be aware that the rules do not say you have to do it in a hidden way. You can look at the random weaknesses that gets added to your deck. I suppose thematically you could explain it as, as a person, as an investigator, you're probably going to be at least peripherally aware of your own weaknesses.
Well, and I think that it should be stressed that not only is it okay to look at your weakness, but I think the game actually is built, it is built around the idea that you're looking at the weakness when you add it to your deck.
Right.
And that whole don't look at it, that was something that I think originated, I can't say if it originated with us, but that's for us, it started at Arkham Knights when we're like, are we looking at these? Oh, let's just do it random. But that was, of course, before we had a permanent basic weakness in our card pool, which a permanent card is one that begins the game in play. Now, obviously, if you're not looking at your basic weakness when you add it to your deck, and then you add that permanent one, while you're not aware of it, that means it's in your deck when it shouldn't be. So really, you should be looking at them, but if you have a way to get around that permanent one, it is still kind of fun to do it without knowing what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Fair enough. So I think that probably covers everything I was looking at from Scott's notes here. Anything else to add on general deck building tips before you actually get into the game?
I just wanted to emphasize the cost curve thing, because I know you guys talked about it, and my computer was having a hiccup, so I didn't get to chime in. But, Just
Did you give it a glass of water?
Yeah, I tried to scare it so it would snap out of it.
Force it to drink it upside down while singing the ABCs.
Yep. It worked. Something worked out of all those approaches. But because I think it's one of those key things that is hardest for new deck builders to wrap their heads around, but once they do, it's kind of like the bar chords of guitar playing. If you're familiar with guitar playing, like once you master those, then you can kind of take off exponentially. But the thing with cost curve,
think about power chords every time I'm looking at my cost curve.
Yeah,
Open C, baby.
It's so easy.
Yeah.
The thing with cost curve is obviously there's a limited amount of resources, and so I guess there's just a couple of helpful tips that I learned that helped me early on. One is kind of the visual. So if you set out your cards in rows of like, oh, I'm going to put all my 0 cost in a row and all my 1 cost in a row and all my 2 costs in a row, etc., you'll get a quick, easy visual like, wow, this pyramid or shape is really heavy. Really tall in the section of like 3 or 4. Like obviously I have a lot of expensive cards. Like the ideal deck shape should be heavy and kind of the cheaper and, you know, fewer cards in the more expensive slots. But this is more advanced, but different investigators, if they have ways to make money, may alter that. But that's the basic. And the other thing that helped me, yeah, the rogues. The other thing with cost curve is that my brain completely forgot what the other thing is.
Did I interrupt your train of thought? That's normally hard to do.
Yeah, I'm such a trained professional by this point, you know. It's just like and now
his secret?
I'm just buying myself time to think about it. So one was looking at the cost curve and okay, I got it. I bought myself enough time. The other thing is just playing out a couple of sample terms without there even being a scenario. Draw your starting hand, pretend you have 5 resources to start, see what cards you can pay for, do it again next turn, and just see what you're able to get out and what stuff is just stuck in your hand. That's an easy way to just test pilot your deck in like 5 minutes.
That's called goldfishing, which is a term I learned from Nate French himself. So it's legit. All right, awesome. So that being said, bought the game, you built your deck, and you're starting to play. So obviously, highly recommend running through the Learn to Play. I think FFG's done a really great job of breaking the rule books up. So the Learn to Play really just gives you what you need to know to get the game rolling. And then the rules reference is going to give you your more in-depth time structure charts and you know, defining keywords and really diving in deep to specific topics. But I think there are a few things that aren't necessarily intuitive, even reading through the Learn to Play, and there are lots of common questions that we see, kind of being active in the community, that newbies often ask. So my recommendation in learning these rules is to learn what is the default way the game works, and then learn what the exceptions are. And that's a really good way to operate, because you learn, okay, unless otherwise specified, this is how the game works. But there are a few exceptions. It's just like learning English. You know, I before E, except after C, except for when it isn't. So I think the bulk of the new player questions that come up have to do with enemy interactions. Because even reading through the rules reference and the Learn to Play, there's a lot going on that it's not immediately apparent how they all interact. There's keywords, there's ways they interplay, there's ways they engage and disengage investigators. So let's kind of cover some of the basics here. So one of the first things you might see about an enemy is when it comes into play. So normally when an enemy comes into play, it's drawn off the encounter deck as part of the Mythos phase. So the default for spawning an enemy when you draw it off the encounter deck is that it spawns into play engaged with the investigator who drew it. That's your default. Unless otherwise specified, that's where it goes. Alright, some common exceptions to that general rule would be most often, if that card has spawn text. So if it has the spawn keyword, it'll tell you where it spawns instead. So for instance, you'll see something on like the Acolyte. It spawns at any empty location. So instead of coming into play engaged with you, it comes into play engaged, or not engaged. It comes into play at any empty location. If it doesn't specify it, if it leaves the option open like that, then you get to choose. If it's something like the... Oh, guys, help me remember what the ghoul is. The ravenous ghoul? The flesh-eating ghoul? Yeah. Anyway, if it's something like in the first scenario where it specifically says spawn attic, then it goes into the attic. Okay, so that's one exception if it actually has spawn text. The other exception is that if it has the keyword aloof. Aloof means that that enemy is not going to engage investigators of its own accord like a normal enemy. An aloof enemy will enter play at the same location as the investigator who drew it. I actually don't think there are. Are there any aloof enemies in the core set? I think it was defined but not used.
Nope.
Don't think so, no.
Okay, so you'll run into that if you buy the Curse of the Rougarou, or as soon as you crack into the Dunwich box. But aloof is another exception to normal spawning. But those exceptions aside, if you draw an enemy, it's popping into play engaged with you. So sorry, Daisy. You're going to have to deal with this thing.
And another important note regarding spawning enemies is that if an enemy spawns under a specific set of conditions, like spawns at the attic, but the attic isn't in play, then that enemy just gets discarded.
Yeah,
it's not put into play at all. So that's a very nice ruling. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, that one was fun. We weren't sure. We were playing at Arkham Knights, which was kind of the pre-release of the game, and the developers were milling around. We actually got to call Matt over, I'm pretty sure, when we figured that out. And be like, oh yeah, it gets discarded, yo.
I think the thing to emphasize, we'll talk about Prey in a second, but I think one of the common misconceptions is Prey has anything to do with where the enemy goes when it's drawn. Because it seems like, oh, Prey, that means like who they like eating, like that. So if I draw Prey, that should go to whoever it tells me to. But literally, you draw a card, the only thing you look for as the exception, like Sean said, is spawn. Otherwise, you own that card. It doesn't matter anything else on that card. You know, if it says spawn, then you spawn it somewhere else. But otherwise, you drew that card. It's yours. Don't try to pawn it off on someone else.
Hey, you can try, but it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Own your monsters. Okay, so talking about Prey, and I think Prey comes into play very closely with the Hunter keyword. So the way these interact is pretty closely tied together. So, Hunter, as you'll learn in the rulebook, determines that an enemy will move and actively seek out investigators as part of the enemy phase. So it will actually move across the board where most enemies, enemies that don't have Hunter anyway, will stay put and wait for an investigator to come to them. They're kind of guarding the location that they're sitting at. So by default, if an enemy has the Hunter keyword at the start of the enemy phase, they move one location closer to the nearest investigator, regardless of whether they have Prey or not. So if there's one investigator that's closer to the Hunter enemy, that's where they go. Even if they have a Prey, an investigator that would fit their Prey criteria, that's farther away. Okay, so that's the default. If there's someone that's closer, they always go there. Exceptions. And this is where Prey primarily comes in. So if there are two or more investigators who are equidistant, same amount away, Prey acts as a tiebreaker. So if it's 2 spaces to the nearest investigator in either direction, if one investigator fulfills the Prey criteria of that Hunter enemy, then they will move toward their prey. Now, however, say you've got, this monster's Prey is the lowest willpowered investigator, and both equidistant investigators have the same amount of willpower, then in that case, the players get to choose. And at the same time, if a Hunter enemy has no Prey, and is equal distance between 2 investigators, again, the players get to choose in that case too. So really, Prey only operates as a tiebreaker. But an enemy will always hunt the nearest investigator because they don't care who they chomp on until there's more than one option.
Right. Like, every enemy in this game is incredibly lazy, so it's gonna go after whatever is closest. If it has a choice, then that's when its preference will exert itself. Like, if I was in the game, my preferred prey might be a nice burrito from the nearest taqueria, but but if that Taco Bell is closer, I'm gonna get Taco Bell because it's closer.
Damn it, Ian! I was gonna go with the Cheetos and Doritos analogy, but you beat me.
But if they're equally distant, then I'll be like, I'll get the good burrito. So, yeah.
Okay, so that's hunter and prey. Next is engagement. So here's the default engagement rule to keep in your mind. Anytime an enemy is ready at the same location as an investigator, or it is as at least one investigator, it will engage that investigator. If there's more than one investigator at the same location where the enemy is ready, then the players get to choose again, unless there's prey that breaks that tie. Prar?
Mm-hmm.
Another thing to keep in mind is even though an enemy will be engaged in most cases with a single investigator, any enemy can be attacked by an investigator if it's at the same location. Even if it's engaged with a specific investigator, as long as that other investigator is at your location, you can still attack that enemy. Pretty simple. Now, exceptions to that default engagement rule of ready, engage. That's really all it is anytime someone's ready, it's going to engage. So here's an exception. Prey, again, like I just mentioned, will supersede player choice. So if an enemy readies at the same location as one or more investigators, and there's one investigator that better fits the prey criteria, that enemy will engage that investigator, but only as a tiebreaker. The other exception is that aloof enemies, like I mentioned, don't engage on their own and cannot be attacked unless they are engaged. So you'll see that in the rulebook. If you look up the aloof keyword, that's what that means. So those are your two main exceptions. The other one that bears mentioning is that massive enemies don't automatically engage a specific investigator because they are considered to be already engaged with every investigator at their location. So if a massive enemy readies, then you don't need to worry about it. He's already with you. Anything to add on engagement?
Nope. I think
That's
that's
a no.
about it.
Ian, talk to us a little bit about skill checks.
Okay, so skill checks are kind of the central part of determining success or failure in this game. It's kind of the replacement for rolling dice. So some of the key rules items that sometimes trip up new players. One is when exactly do you get to commit cards, play cards that are going to affect this skill check. So that might be skill cards that you commit to the test. That might be an asset that lets you improve your skill. Those kind of effects. Those happen before the token gets pulled. So there's no like, oh, I drew this token, now let me adjust my skill up to make up the difference, unless a card specifically lets you do that. Those are the exceptions, which we'll cover in a second. But in general, any card that's going to modify your skill before you take a test, you're going to take care of those before you actually reveal the token. Otherwise, the game would be way too easy. So the key exceptions that you can think about, one of them is lucky. So this is a card that specifically states after you fail a skill test, or after you would fail, I can't remember the exact
When
wording.
you would fail.
When you would fail.
Not after, Ian. You've already failed it at that point.
So when you would fail, it lets you increase your skill. So that's an exception where you actually get to see what the token is and then improve your skill. That's why Lucky is such a good card, because it breaks that key timing. There's a few other ones. There's Windy in the core set, who basically lets you get a mulligan on whatever token, put it back, draw another one, and then at the cost of discarding a card. So those are some key exceptions to the rule of you always kind of play all the cards that are going to affect a test before you draw the token.
Awesome.
So the other one is, what about negative skill? So what if you're rolling with your one combat against the rats, and then you happen to draw -2? So that's obviously going to drop your skill in combat down to a -1, to a negative number. But the way it works is that that doesn't happen. If anything goes below 0, then it gets resolved as if it is a 0, actually. So in that case, you would fail still, but you would fail at a 0 instead of a -1, which you might think, like, why does it matter? But there are certain cases, certain cards where it matters, because it matters how much you failed, or, maybe there's certain cards that trigger off that, or whatever the case may be.
We're looking at you, rotting remains.
So, negative numbers, you do calculate it to figure out what it went down by, but then it becomes 0 if it's a negative. The other thing is kind of the big question for skill cards in particular. Again, these are the ones you commit for their icons to improve your skill against the test. Some of them provide certain bonuses. The neutral skill cards in the core set, there's flavors for each of the skills, for intellect, for combat, for willpower, all of those. And they have a little kicker that says, if the test is successful, you draw 1 card. So kind of the big new player question is, well, who gets to actually draw that card? Is it the person who's taking the test, or the person who's helping them out? Because in multiplayer, you can commit cards to help someone else out. So the answer to that is actually whoever plays that card gets the bonus. So if my friend is playing, trying to take out those rats in a combat test, and I commit my overpower skill card to boost their combat, if they succeed, then I get the card instead of them getting the card.
Seems fair.
Yep. So the key exceptions to that is if the card modifies the results of the test, or if it would apply to the investigator performing the check. So, and a good example of that is the skill card deduction in the core set, which says that, if the skill test is successful, you get another clue. Well, the investigator who is doing the investigation is the one getting a clue, so they get the extra clue. It wouldn't make sense for the other investigator to get it in that case.
Awesome. So the last one that we're going to talk about here that often trips up new players is one that's near and dear to my heart as primarily a Mystic player. So it has to do with advancing the Agenda and the Act decks. So basically the Agenda deck, as you'll see, are the cards, basically the story and the agenda of the Encounter deck, what the Encounter deck is trying to accomplish in its play. And the Act deck is the flip side of that, is what you as the investigators are trying to do throughout the game. So advancing the agenda comes up because there are kind of some interesting interactions with how Doom, which is the primary mover of why an agenda might advance, works kind of across the board. So remember this as your default. The agenda can only advance after the natural addition of 1 Doom at the beginning of the Mythos phase. So at the beginning of each Mythos phase, you add 1 Doom to the agenda, and then, and only then, unless otherwise specified, does the game check to see whether the Doom threshold that's listed on the agenda meets the threshold, and if it does, then it will advance. Now, outside of that, it will not advance. Fair enough. So the exception to that is if a card that adds Doom specifically says this may cause the agenda to advance. So, for instance, there is a couple cards in the core set. Biggest one that's also repeated, at least so far we have probably in half the scenarios through the Dunwich Legacy cycle, is called Ancient Evils. So it's Revelation, when revealed, add a Doom to the agenda. This may cause the agenda to advance. So say you're at 5 of 6. Say you're at 4 of 6 going into the Mythos phase. As part of the regular Mythos phase, you place 1 Doom on the agenda to be at 5 of 6. You draw Ancient Evils. You're now at 6 of 6, and it specifically says the agenda may advance at this point, even though normally you've passed by the check. yes, the agenda can advance. Now, as opposed to something like chanting, what's the chanting treachery? Help me, guys. Mysterious chanting, as a revelation, tells you to place 2 doom on the nearest cultist enemy. Now, even if placing those doom puts you over the doom threshold, since that card does not specifically say this does not advance, or this may cause the agenda to advance, you don't have to worry about it that turn. However, it should put some pep in your step to go kill that cultist, because chances are next turn is going to be a little bit more painful. Okay, so that's the agenda. Mm-hmm. I think another big thing to cover with the agenda is that when the agenda advances, you remove all doom from any card in play.
Mm-hmm.
So particularly...
including your own.
Yes, especially your own. Because many, well, not many, there's a few Mystic cards at this point in the card pool that add doom to your own cards for some...
Too many.
For some general splashy effect. So Mystics take solace in the fact that when the doom, or when the agenda advances, the doom is removed from your cards, and now that card is no longer a liability to the team. So there's some finesse and nuance as to when you play those cards. For instance, playing the Arcane Initiate in what's called the Witching Hour, or what we call the Witching Hour, where it's the turn right before the agenda is going to advance anyway, just through the normal framework of the game. You play down that Arcane Initiate that comes in with a doom. Now that doom doesn't really matter because the agenda was going to advance anyway. But again, it doesn't advance when you play the Initiate. It only checks to see if you have the doom threshold at the beginning of the Mythos phase, unless otherwise specified. I think that's a big one that trips up new players. And it makes a big difference for gameplay, which is why I'm harping on it so much. Mm-hmm. You can advance the turn 3 turns early if you're not careful.
Yep.
Okay, so that's the agenda. So now moving to the Act deck. So the Act deck will generally have some kind of clue requirement for the investigators as a whole as to when, how many clues are required to advance the Act. So the default rule for advancing the Act is that once the clue requirement or any other requirements listed on the card are completed, you can advance that Act at any time. You could also, or otherwise, trigger a free triggered action, so the little squiggly lightning mark. Anytime you could normally do one of those, you could advance the Act. So commonly what will happen, at least in my plays, is the threshold for clues will be met maybe at the end of the overall investigator phase. Maybe there's only like 1 or 2 actions left for the investigators as a whole. Well, maybe at that point you don't want to advance the Act. You want to have a lot of actions left to deal with whatever's going to happen after the Act advances. So you can wait until the beginning of the next turn. And then, like, right away at the beginning of the first investigator's turn, at the beginning of the investigator phase, advance the Act, and then move on with your day. Exceptions to that would be if there are specific restrictions listed on that Act card. So, for instance, in the opening scenario, in the Gathering, you'll see in, I think it's Act 2, that only investigators in the hallway can spend the requisite amount of clues to advance the Act, because everyone has to gather in the hallway to bring together the elements that they need to spend to advance the Act. So there's a restriction on location. Normally, anyone can be anywhere unless it's specified. Another example might be it costs an action to advance or to spend those clues. Or, as you'll see in the couple first quests in the Dunwich Legacy box, once the players have the specified amount of clues, the Act automatically advances, so you don't even have a choice. So just pay attention for those kind of exceptions, but as a default, once you have the clues, you get to choose when the Act advances. So, as we kind of clear up these common player, pitfalls, as it were, I would encourage everyone, if you have questions, check out the rules reference, check out the Learn to Play guide, but also FFG keeps an ongoing frequently asked questions guide to supplement their rulebook out on their website. So if you go to the FFG website, find the Arkham Horror the Card Game page, you can find the support page and find the most recent FAQ that's been released by FFG. I think they generally do about 2 per year. At least that's, if I've been keeping track in Lord of the Rings, that's what it tends to be. So the most recent one that we had, I think, was dropped in March, right, guys? its main.
I believe
somewhere
so,
around there. Yeah.
Anyway,
March-ish.
so again, the whole point of that FAQ is to supplement the regular rule book, address those frequently asked questions. So you might find what you're looking for in the FAQ if it's not in the rules reference.